Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and welcome to Everything Cooperative this wonderful, wonderful day. You know, we have Mr. David Thompson on the line with us this morning from California. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Vernon. How are you today?
I am great. I am really, really great. And I consistently and continuously look for your book talking about the co-ops and the civil rights movement. When am I going to be able to read that thing?
Well, it's going to be a little while. In my professional business, we build nonprofit housing, and we are the busiest we've ever been. And so that takes, putting a roof over somebody's head takes precedence over another page of my book. So it's going to be a couple of years.
All right. So you are building co-op housing?
No, nonprofit housing.
Nonprofit housing.
Right.
So what kind of projects do you have online?
Well, we have 500 units in process at the moment, and a majority of those are nonprofit housing for seniors and nonprofit housing for people with disabilities. That's the things that Neighborhood Partners does the best.
Neat. 500 units. That's a lot. And this is in California?
Yeah, just in California.
All right, buddies.
Right. Yeah, cooperatives are what I'd love to do, but it's not so easy to build housing cooperatives.
Is that because of financing?
Somewhat, but it's mainly because in California the land is so costly that to be able to, if you do a project at market rate, it has to be a pretty high cost, and we're always looking for cooperative housing to be affordable to people at moderate income levels, and you can't make it pencil out, and there's no government money for to subsidize cooperatives. So there's no road like the tax credit program.
I find that always interesting. Now, it's a little bit away from civil rights and cooperatives, but I find it interesting that if you look at housing co-ops, and there was a study done, NCB financed it, but it looked at HUD-funded housing co-ops compared to HUD-funded apartment buildings, and in every variable, whether that's the amount of rent over time, how well the property was kept, how good people felt in their community, and they had a say in it, and all of those, every variable you could think of. Also, return on investment was higher in the co-op. The co-ops outperformed. They paid their taxes. They had less crime, every variable. And you're going to go, why won't politicians put money into something that works better? And that's always frustrated me. Always frustrated me. So they come out with tax credits, and who wins on a tax credit deal? And
right.
That's sort of, I've come to conclude that the people that win on a tax credit deal are the people that already have money. That's the ones that can afford tax credits. And then those are the ones that also build apartment buildings for the most part, unless there's a company like yours that does it for nonprofit. And then they make the money off of the apartment buildings. So it's the people that already have money are making money. It's more in this this huge gap in wealth. And our government is supporting that.
Okay. Yeah. That's the way it is at the moment.
All right, so we've got to change that. So let's go back to civil rights and the co-op movement. And I'm always curious, and you've told me sometime before since you've been on the program, of how you get into this, being a chap from England. How'd you get into the civil rights movement and co-ops as a passion?
Well, the origin of it, I think I would say, is that my parents ran a pub in the east of England and a public house, with a little hotel above. It was an inn, as you might say.
Mm-hmm.
We had room for about 22 overnight guests. And we were very close to a USAF air base. And at the weekend, the people on the base who were off came into town for, to fun, music, go to the cinema, go to a ballroom, go for a drink or something like that. But regretfully, and this is in 1953, the pubs in town put up a color bar so that they all the pubs in town agreed that they would not serve black airmen. They would serve white, but not black. And my mother and father took it upon themselves to say that we are not going to do that. We are not going to be discriminatory, and we will serve black airmen. So as a result, our pub became very popular with the black airmen that were on the base and came into town. And many of them became really good friends. And one of them, whose name was Wesley, was the boxing champion. And I loved boxing. And so he would bring me boxing gloves and various other things from the base. And my parents let them stay in the lodging upstairs. And, of course, that was the only place they could stay in Boston. So we still had rationing in England until 1956 or so. So one of the things that Wes did is he bought things at the PX for our family so that we could, get sugar, flour, meat, various other things like that just weren't available on the regular market. And I became, adopted by the black airmen that came. As a young kid, I'd be about 11 years old. But I was well aware of the discrimination and why they were staying at the pub, and all of the other pubs in town put a blockade on doing business with my parents because they were breaking that blockade. So we felt a certain level of that discrimination, certainly not the same as what Wes and his fellow people were doing. So that brought me into touch with the civil rights movement, with the rights of blacks. And when I came to the United States, I became involved with the civil rights movement as soon as I arrived, and it was in Florida. And
what year was that?
New York.
What year was that when you came?
That would be 1962.
Okay.
Right. So I became involved in activities in Florida and then in New York City. And in New York City, I was the chief shop steward for the Union for the Restaurant Workers, and our restaurant would not employ blacks. And I worked with the rest of the people in the union to force the restaurant owner to accept that blacks could be employed if they were good enough and had the same quality and characteristics. They could get jobs. And so we broke the color bar for Restaurant Associates, which owned about 10 major restaurants in New York at the time.
Wow. So as a kid, you got candy bar, chocolate from the blacks.
Yeah, Double Bubble. My first Double Bubble was from Wes.
In 1962, I think I was going into high school. And I think, maybe the ninth grade, I was still in middle school. So you were over here and in the civil rights movement already. Good news.
Yeah.
Good news. Now, your parents must have been very brave.
They were. Some people might also say they were foolish. But I tend to think of them as brave and ethical and just very committed to doing what was the correct thing. My mother was very Christian, and she looked at it from the point of view of being a good Christian.
Okay, I'm a Christian too, but I don't want to go down that road because people that read the Bible, they just seem to come up with different interpretations than I do. So sometimes people that read the Bible and they say they are Christians, they'll do just the opposite, and they sort of say slavery was God's way and all of that. So,
Yeah.
So she read the Bible and maybe came away with the same kind of interpretation I do, that we're all made in God's image.
Yeah. She was very determined. She was indefatigable.
Okay, that's a new term for me too. Okay.
She wasn't going to give up. She was committed to doing that, and that's what she did.
So in New York, were you in 1962 in New York?
Correct. Uh-huh.
So you were there when they were forming the March on Washington.
Yes, I was. Mm-hmm.
And were you involved in that at all?
No. I was at that time. I was just involved in the union efforts to break the color bar at Restaurant Associates.
So let's talk a little bit about Penn South in New York. So Penn South is a co-op, and you have told me before that sort of like was the home of the development of the March on Washington. That's where things took place. That's where organizing happened. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Bayard Rustin, who was the main organizer of the March on Washington, lived at Penn South Co-op. And amongst the people living in the same cooperative were a group that came to be the core organizing committee of the March on Washington, and they lived at that co-op, and they were, the key activists in developing the March on Washington. The first meeting was called at Bayard Rustin's co-op apartment.
And Bayard seems to be a brilliant person, as you've told me about him and as I've read about him. But he
Correct.
seemed like he would have been crazy too. I'm surprised because he was a communist, he was gay, and he was
a Quaker.
He was a Quaker? Okay. Okay. And he was in this civil rights movement in a big way. I'm surprised that people didn't try to kill him back then.
Well, I'm sure they did. He has been a symbol of many different civil rights struggles, but in particular the March on Washington, and he was the main organizer behind many of the major black activities during the 50s and 60s.
Well, David,
David,
we've got to take our first break. We're going to come back and talk some more about Bayard Rustin and the civil rights movement and the way co-ops have worked in and been a part of the civil rights movement. But we'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial. Information is power. Information is power. And this is why WL makes a great partner for this show, because here we are giving you information so that if you use that information and knowing which co-ops that you can go work with, how to start a co-op, how you can get power, how you can in your community, using that power is where it comes from. So we're talking about Bayard Rustin before we left Mr. David Thompson. And it seems like that Penn South, as a co-op, a place to live, is a community in which would protect him. It's sort of like, I have it sort of like as an incubator. It could be a place where it's a community. People know each other and work together and strive together to help support each other in the values of co-ops, of honesty, openness, social responsibility, and caring for others. That might be how he was able to survive and why that became sort of like the hub of this organizing for the March on Washington.
Yeah. The co-op had been sponsored by the Amalgamated Workers Union, and they gave a preference early on to union members, and Bayard, being an activist also within the union community, was asked if he would like to be there, and he said yes. A. Philip Randolph, who was the head of the International Pullman Workers Union, the first black union leader and the chair of the March on Washington, he also lived at the co-op in his later years. And Norman Hill, who organized the staff for the March on Washington, lived there. Rochelle Horowitz, who was also with the unions and lived there, she ran the transportation for the March on Washington, and a number of people lived in her apartment during the work on the March on Washington. So Penn South was a great place to be, and at the heart of all of that activity.
So is Penn South about 500 units?
No, it's good question you would ask. No, it's I think it's close to 3,000.
Wow.
I could be wrong, but it's a pretty large co-op, and it's on the same street as the Empire State Building, I think.
Okay.
That 23rd Street. It goes for about 6 city blocks.
Okay, so that's a great place to live, to organize, and the civil rights movement back there. You had the FBI against the folks, and you had a lot of things that he had to dodge and take care of. So I just see him as a great guy. Yes, yeah, amazing.
And it's interesting. The FBI, of course, have had to publish all of their records of Bayard Rustin. And so a lot that I have found out about different phone calls he made, meetings he went to that entail cooperatives, I found out through the FBI records. So I am thankful to the FBI for some things.
Okay. So we're in New York getting ready for the March on Washington. And what are some of the other people that had a role in, like I'd say you talk about Harry Belafonte was a key fundraiser for the march? Yes.
Mr. Belafonte himself had recently organized a housing cooperative. He was not able, in the late 50s, there was still a color bar going on in New York for property. And so blacks were not encouraged or generally not allowed to buy property. There was some street in New York City above which blacks could and below which they couldn't. And Harry Belafonte wanted to live closer downtown to where his work was and his entertainment was, and found that he went to look at this apartment to try to buy it. And when he said he would buy it, the owner said, well, you can't. I'm not going to sell it to you, and turned him down. Belafonte sent his business manager back a week later to buy the apartment, and the business manager was allowed to buy the apartment, but he was buying it with Mr. Belafonte's money. And so the unit became his. But Belafonte then turned around and worked with other people, and they bought all of the apartments in the building and turned it into a housing cooperative. And Lena Horne was one of the original members of that particular cooperative. But it was in that co-op apartment that Martin Luther King stayed when he was going to New York for whatever it was that he did, and that's where he wrote his famous speech for the Riverside Church against the Vietnam War. And in that co-op housing unit, it was regarded as the center for the Southern activists for civil rights. That apartment of Harry Belafonte was regarded as the New York office of all of those groups.
So you have co-ops as a huge sort of role in the civil rights movement of the March on Washington and Martin Luther King staying there. Who were some of the other people involved?
Well, another one would be James Farmer. James Farmer was the head of CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. He lived in a housing cooperative on the southwest side of New York City. He organized numerous activities. Many of the key CORE meetings were held there. There was a huge protest against the World's Fair at the time because they were not employing enough blacks to work on the site because there was a lot of employment through the World's Fair in New York at the time. And CORE took a pretty big role in that. And then CORE also led lots of efforts to break down housing segregation. And so that co-op apartment that he lived in was a critical part of the organizing of that time. He was supposed to speak at the March on Washington, but he had been arrested a couple of days earlier and couldn't get bail, and therefore his place at the March on Washington was taken by his deputy, Floyd McKissick.
Nothing like going to jail for what you believe in. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Eleanor Holmes, she lives right here in D.C.
She is wonderful representative. She worked on the march. She was actually the person given the job of closing down the office on the Saturday of the march and flying into D.C. And she was up there in New York working on it. She was living at Rachel Horowitz's apartment at Penn South and going to work every day to organize the march. And throughout her life, Eleanor Norton Holmes has been a very strong supporter of cooperatives, craft cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, housing cooperatives, and that has been a part of what she has supported while she has been in Congress. And so she became the first elected representative of the District of Columbia.
She's been there quite a long time. I think we'd try to reach out and get her on the show. I didn't know she had that big interest in co-ops.
Yeah.
I know John Lewis does, so can you speak on him a little bit? So,
well, John is somebody that I have tremendous regard for, and I also have a friendship with. Well, John, of course, was, there's a funny little story there with John Lewis. He was practicing his speech for the March on Washington. He was in New York City going over the last details of the march with all of the other leaders and practicing his speech. And the people in his hotel told him that he couldn't keep speaking like that. It was too loud and it was disturbing the other guests, and he had to get out. So he called Rochelle Horowitz and said, I've been turned out of my hotel because I'm talking too much, so may I come there and practice my speech? So John Lewis then turned up at her apartment, knocked on the door, came in, and then started doing his speech. So Rochelle said she heard his speech before it ever was heard by everybody, and it was a pretty amazing speech because of what he said and how he said it. But that speech was practiced at the Penn South Co-op. Later on in his professional life...
David, we've got to take our second break here already, and we'll come back and talk more about John Lewis. We'll be right back.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOS and 95.9 FM.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. The program is Everything Cooperative, and we have Mr. David Thompson on the line with us. We're talking about blacks and the role of the civil rights movement. And before we took break, we were talking about John Lewis, who gave a speech, and he's the last living speaker at that 1963 march. Continue talking about John Lewis, would you?
Well, I think that John was about 22 when he gave his speech. He was extremely young relative to the other participants, but, he represented the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and, did a lot of work for cooperatives while he was with SNCC, and then he worked for 2 or 3 other organizations in the South that were working on economic development, and in that role he helped to support the creation of a number of different cooperatives, crafts, consumer, credit unions, housing, that kind of thing. And where I met John was we offered him a job with the National Cooperative Bank when it was created to be our liaison to black communities throughout the United States. And I had the proud honor of going with John when he did a tour of California, meeting with Tom Bradley as the mayor of L.A. and Willie Brown as the mayor of San Francisco, and other black elected officials to encourage them to support black cooperatives. And John was extremely good and knowledgeable about all of that, and it is something that in another life he would have been really, really good at, but I'm glad, as I think most Americans would be, that he has been just such a figurehead for the civil rights movement in the United States.
Well, that makes him about 78 if he was 22 in 1963, 56 years ago. So
yeah.
2 years ago, he spoke at the Federation of Southern Co-ops 50th anniversary, which was started in 1967, was right during the Civil Rights Movement, where this cooperative of co-ops was formed, and they've been on the show several times.
Right. Yeah, John has always been, through his being a Congress member on the Hill, he has always been extremely supportive of getting funding, especially from the USDA, for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives to help deal with black poverty in the rural South.
So with that, it's a great segue into talking about Charles and Shirley Sherrod. Because they sued the USDA. Can you talk a little bit about them?
Well, they too are two of my heroic people. Charlie Sherrod, if you read any book about civil rights in the 1960s and you go to the index, you will see Charlie Sherrod mentioned in that index because he played such a role. But he was determined to work in Albany, Georgia in particular, on movements that would benefit the local economy, especially for blacks. And one thing that he and his wife Shirley developed was, I think it was called New Communities USA, but it was the first land trust in America. What Charlie and others had figured out was if we could own land and then lease it to black farmers, that was the way in which we could get black farmers back onto the land. And so I believe that they accumulated over 1,000 acres of land near New Albany, Georgia, and created that type of community. But when they took those farmers to the USDA to borrow money for crops and various other things, the USDA would find ways not to lend them money. And as a result, the New Communities Land Trust went into bankruptcy because of its inability to get loans for the work that it was doing.
Wow.
And they took USDA to court. It was in court for many, many years, but eventually the USDA agreed that they had been discriminating against new communities, and they were the cause of that, and therefore they owed all of the people that had created it money, and the Sherrods have now put all of that money together. They bought new land, and they've started all over again, even though they are in their 70s.
Well, I had a chance to meet them, and they're my heroes also. It's awesome what they were able to do back then and still are doing. So we got all of this going on, and you have mentioned there was what was called the Big Six in the march, and you mentioned A. Philip Randolph and Baynard Rustin, James Farmer, and John Lewis. The other two, could you talk about them? Roy Wilkins, director of NAACP, and Whitney Young, executive director of Urban League.
Well, Roy Wilkins was the head of NAACP for many, many years. He was a quiet leader, but very, very, very committed, and was the head of the NAACP during the most difficult years of which you could be head of that organization because of all that went on after the Second World War in particular. Wilkins supported a lot of development of cooperatives. The NAACP in its earlier period was a big supporter of cooperatives, and part of that came through the efforts of Ella Jo Baker, who was the New York office manager of the NAACP, and somebody who had grown up organizing cooperatives and developing cooperatives and had a tremendous impact upon Harlem during the 1930s and 40s, and was, in many people's minds, one of the great minds of the civil rights movement, and particularly of the commitment to democratic control over the agendas of the organizations. But Roy Wilkins was fortunate enough to get housing. The United Nations had built housing for its employees because they knew that they had so many employees that would be coming from, developing countries and would be people of color, and that they would not be able to find any place that easy to live in New York City. So the United Nations actually built a very, very large apartment complex and made it available to the employees so that they didn't have to suffer the discrimination that was occurring. Roy Wilkins was lucky enough to be able to get one of the apartments at that particular apartment building. That apartment building, Roy Wilkins and his wife voted for it, but that apartment building voted to go co-op, and Roy Wilkins regretfully died of a heart attack the year that building became a housing cooperative and therefore a safe home for many, many hundreds of people of color in New York City.
Wow. And Whitney Young?
Whitney Young came from a different element of the civil rights movement. He was the executive director of the Urban League. I think he came out of Detroit or Chicago, so he hadn't had to deal with the same sort of color bar issues in the same way as they were dealing with them in New York. And I believe when he came to New York, he had enough money to buy a home in upstate. Well, not upstate, but I think it's upper New York City, which is where blacks were allowed to own homes. So he was the only one that wasn't living, of all of them, who wasn't living in a co-op or a protected apartment. And the Urban League did quite a lot for cooperatives in its early times for economic development to benefit black creation. But the Urban League's model was much more tied into getting jobs for blacks in firms that were kind of in the Fortune 500 companies, and they were very successful at being able to create a larger workforce opportunity for black workers, but they didn't take an interest in developing black cooperatives for blacks themselves.
So what was the role of the Big Six in the march?
Well, they were the original decision-making group for the March on Washington. The first two were Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. They brought in then I think James Farmer, and then they invited Martin Luther King to join, and he was reticent about it, but eventually decided that he would. And Roy Wilkins was the last person to come on board. Wilkins did not want to be associated with Bayard Rustin because of his ex-communist affiliations. And what the Big Six then decided was that Philip Randolph would be named as the chair of the march and Bayard Rustin would be the director. And that way, Roy Wilkins agreed that if that was going to be the status, then he would support it, but he would not support a march where Bayard Rustin was the leader.
Okay. All right. So that is a tremendous history. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So why co-ops? What makes co-ops so unique or beneficial, particularly for marginalized people, whether they're black or brown or Asian or anybody, even whites? There's more white people than black people, more white poor people in the U.S. than black poor people. So why co-ops? What's the benefits of co-ops?
Well, co-ops, for the main part, do their best when they are serving their members. And in many cases, people of color and people of lower classes, they are neglected by the marketplace. And so therefore, they end up paying more for things than most people do. And so the idea of joining together to create a grocery co-op so that you can buy food a little cheaper and you can get better quality food is one of the ways in which cooperatives can service people. But you can also create jobs for the local neighborhood and therefore help to, fight poverty in that particular area. So food cooperatives have played quite often a role, and they're probably the most present type of cooperative in the world when you sort of count it by the numbers of consumers who are members.
David, I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're going into our last break. We'll be right back and talk more about the benefits of co-ops. Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and David Thompson is our guest on Everything Co-op, which is sponsored. We've been sponsored now for 5.5 years by NCB, and NCB's mission is to support and be an advocate for America's cooperatives and their members, especially in low-income communities, by providing innovative financial and related services. So we're talking about the benefits of co-ops, and before we took the break, you said that you can normally get better quality products and you can create jobs. And this is particularly true in low-income communities, and that's why NCB was formed to help these communities that we're talking about. So what are some of the other benefits, David?
Well, in many ways, I feel that a lot of people get their first sense of democratic organizations through the cooperatives that may be in their neighborhood. It's always very difficult for poor people, in particular, of any particular color or creed, to see, how the world is controlled. And so seeing a cooperative in your neighborhood, knowing that its members are people like your parents and your grandparents, and that it is run by the community and run for the community. So you get your first taste of democracy in cooperatives in most of the areas of the world where poverty is. So that's one of the best things for it. But it helps promote leadership, showing people how to become leaders and how to stay leaders. And throughout the world, many people who were once active in the cooperative movement then, move into politics and nonprofit worlds and play a big role in those as they proceed through their lives. So quite a lot of politicians and political offices are held by people who started off in cooperatives.
Yeah, I've heard that sometimes they go into school boards, city council.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They learn how to organize in this social wealth. They can create social wealth and financial wealth in a co-op.
Correct.
Okay. So I have it that you get better quality products, and a lot of times at a lower price, at least as good a price as the marketplace, and sometimes lower price, can create jobs. And you have this democratic organization, so you can learn how to work in a democratic organization with an organization that's run by and for the people. And this promotes leadership.
It does.
Get social and political, social and financial wealth. I guess political wealth comes out of that too. Okay, learn how to organize.
Yeah.
So in this world of co-ops and the civil rights movement, we didn't talk about the Highlander School, but you get education and training and everything going on. Why do they fail? What happens to co-ops? What goes on? What's your idea behind that?
Well, like other businesses, cooperatives do fail. You were using statistics earlier, but the failure rate of cooperatives is the lowest of any corporate form of business in the United States. So cooperatives last longer than any other kind of business, but on occasion they do fail, and they may fail for reasons such as the change in the marketplace. The thing that I'm regretting most at this particular point is that the Uber and Lyft programs are seen by people as having lots of virtues, but there are some downsides. And one of the biggest downsides is their impact upon the taxi cooperatives all around the United States. Most people wouldn't know it, but when you get into a cab in many cities, that cab is owned by a driver who is a member of a cooperative, and the cooperative is the one that runs the organization. But by banding together as a cooperative, those taxi drivers, have a better and a more efficient business and more capacity, etc. But those cooperatives which were grown over 30 or 50 years by the taxi drivers all around the country have really suffered. And, for example, the biggest cab service in San Francisco was Yellow Cab Cooperative. That went bust about 3 years ago because of the impact of Uber and Lyft, and it is now a privately owned organization. So I'm assuming that a lot of members of that taxi cab cooperative lost money because of the bankruptcy. And so you do have that kind of moment that happens, but I'm really regretful that Uber has destroyed one of the largest groupings of small business cooperatives. In this case, in the United States, often held by minority groups.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the marketplace changes, and that's a great example of technology coming in place and being used, and we lose these co-ops. What are some other reasons?
Well, some of the other reasons may be that the cooperative leadership doesn't keep up with the changing nature of their neighborhood. It may be also that the invasion of the neighborhood by big box stores and other major national retailers makes it impossible for a small cooperative to have the resources to compete against that kind of goings on, and because the cooperative is small and hasn't grown, it just is no longer capable of withstanding that kind of competition. So you have those types of cooperatives who eventually, have to close down. Sometimes, they're not well run. Management is not doing its job, and the board isn't actively watching the management, and the cooperative goes out of business through the deficiency of its board and management, and that's always a tragedy because that particular failure didn't have to happen, but it does. It's not often, but it does happen.
Well, I found in housing co-ops that one of the other side of it is whenever greed gets in there. Either by the board or management or developers or whatever, greed gets in the way, particularly the gentrification, like happens in D.C. and San Francisco, New York, L.A., that when greed gets in, then the co-op can go under and people do crazy things.
Well, if people, are by transforming their co-op from a limited equity type of format to a condo market rate format, people can make, $200,000-$300,000 in California in particular. Mm-hmm. It's very, very hard for somebody to turn down that kind of offer. And so we have in California now limited equity cooperatives so that we have a legal format that people can't do that, and therefore we put a stop to cooperatives being dissolved for personal gain. But many of the cooperatives in the country don't have that legal restriction, and therefore every year we see, a few co-ops here and there who go private, as you might say.
I want to change it a little bit to the upbeat, is that in Jessica Gordon-Nimhard's book, Collective Courage, she talks about that in the capitalistic model that like 90% of the business that start are no longer in existence after 5 years. But we're in a cooperative model, you have 10% are out of business in 5 years. So you have a much greater success rate in co-ops than you do for a whole lot of great reasons, people working together, particularly in pooling their resources and talents, and learning how to work democratically, which you've already talked about. So it doesn't happen that often, but I just really wanted to talk a little bit about when it does happen. I also heard, and I don't know where I heard this or read it, that sometimes, particularly for black co-ops, that the people in the power, white folks, didn't want them to survive because that gave them power and they wanted to keep control over folks. So maybe that happened. But David, before we leave, we only have a couple more minutes. What about this resilience of co-ops? I know in the Great Depression and the Great Recession, 07, 08, that they performed well. They outperformed. They didn't have few failing compared to a capitalistic model. Why do you think that's so?
Well, I think in particular under times of pressure, when people in the neighborhood come together and form a food cooperative, and it's really the key to saving a few dollars, getting better quality food, having a few jobs in the neighborhood, and that responsibility is shared by a few thousand other people. Those people will put their money up. They will buy the shares in the co-op. They will put equity into the cooperative. They will be loyal to the co-op. They'll shop at the co-op. They'll speak about it wherever it is that they go. And the determination shared collectively by those thousands of members is what allows the co-op to succeed when a local corner store isn't going to have that same type of community support.
We got to leave it at that, Dave. Thank you so very much. Always, it's a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Everybody out
Bye,
there.
Everybody.
Live a cooperative week. Thanks.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOS at 95.9 FM.